Hello and welcome to Slick Talk. I'm your host, Joe. Today's episode is going to be our first foray into the wide world of motorcycles. And what better way to get the ball rolling than to bring on Luke. Luke is a man of many hats here at Blackstone. He started out as a writer. Now he's in the lab getting the data to the writers, so that way we can get the reports to you in a quick, accurate manner. And without further ado, let's start the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Joe.
So what's on the list today? What are you doing? Are you neck deep in aircraft samples? What's on the agenda?
Doing titrations today. We're setting up a new auto titrator in the lab I work in.
But titration was definitely not something you probably imagined yourself getting involved in day one. So just going back to your starting point at Blackstone. You walked in the door. What did you see yourself doing? What was the job going to be when you first discovered Blackstone?
Writing reports, I guess, or what we refer to as writing reports, which is analyzing data and doing the report summaries.
And moving over to the lab, has that really changed your perspective at all as far as when it comes to report writing? Has it changed your outlook on the business as a whole? What's the transition been like for you?
Yeah, transition to the lab, it gives you a lot deeper understanding of what goes into producing test results and the nuances to the tests, and just keeping things running well. So now I do in track of equipment calibrations, and I make the standards for the spectrometer, and it's quite involved to produce reliable and consistent results.
And when you are not doing that, I know you at least spend a fair amount of time tending to a couple of motorcycles you got, and that's really why we wanted to bring you onto the show. So just for our listeners, what are the motorcycles you have in your stable right now?
The two I have a 1972 Honda CB750 and a 1978 BMW R100/7.
So which one came into your life first?
The Honda.
And the Honda, I mean, I've seen it in person. It looks fantastic. But just for the listeners, when you got it, what kind of shape was it in? Did it look anything like it does now?
It was rough. My grandpa owned it. I think he bought it in '74. My dad rode it in high school. And they had a room in the side of their house that they parked the motorcycles in. And it was walled in at some point, I think in '81. And I pulled it out in 2011.
So what was the lead up to getting that thing out? Did you have to talk to him and say, I'm ready to bring this thing back to life? Like, what was the process like?
I knew it was there, and I liked those old Hondas. And I was in college. Didn't have much money, and at the time it wasn't worth much. It had been sitting 30-some years. The engine was seized, and it was covered in a pretty good layer of dirt and oil, which actually I think preserved it to some extent. But we pulled it out, and over the course of about 6 months, we did a basic top-end rebuild and tore it all down, painted all the stuff that needed painted, and did basically basic mechanical repairs, kind of bring it up to speed.
And a lot of this too, you were kind of basically learning as you went, right?
In that case, yes, that was how I learned to work on stuff, essentially.
And there's no, I guess, universal training guide. So was it mostly YouTube videos? How did you go about it?
Shop manuals. There's a good forum for those particular bikes, the pretty active community. And there's good aftermarket support too. People road race them and stuff, so you can get good quality parts. Quite a bit from Honda still too.
So how long, from the time you pull this Honda out of hibernation, to getting it up to speed, what's the time frame?
It was an obsessive thing for about 4 months, I think from February until July of that year. And then it's been kind of a constant evolution for about the last decade to where it is now.
And during that time span, I just imagine, 4 months is a while, so was there a point where you were like, I don't think this is going to happen? Was there like a roadblock where you might not have been able to get a hold of a certain part, or you didn't know exactly how to take the next step in the process. Like, was it pretty much smooth, steady, we're getting there? Or was there any points of doubt, I guess?
No, I was too stubborn to not finish it. When I did a basic reseal on the top end, and there's a bushing on the lower cam chain tensioner roller that I found on the bench after we had buttoned the engine up and were ready to put it in the bike. And it took a couple of days of hemming and hawing as to whether or not that part was in there or not. So that was a setback. I had to take the whole top end apart to put that bushing in there, which saved some expensive repairs that would have happened not too long after. But yeah, for the most part, it was just stubborn persistence and kind of learning as I went.
So surely then, I mean, you got this one, and then you come across the BMW afterwards, and you think, well, I mean, I had this one licked, so I can do another one, or were you not that confident when you came across the BMW?
No, I just wanted a BMW.
So it is
a couple of years prior, my dad had bought he has an 82 R80 RT, like a touring bike from that era, and I had ridden it some, and yeah, I'm always on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace looking for stuff I shouldn't buy.
Indeed. If there's one thing, I think if you spent some time in the writer's room with Luke, you probably came across some Craigslist browsing.
Always on lunch, not on the clock.
Oh, never on the clock. Never on the clock. Don't get it twisted. But yeah, just for the listeners, though, so it's a 78 R100, right? The BMW?
Yeah, /7 Series.
And that's obviously a entirely different engine from the Honda. So
yeah, they're very different.
Same process as far as going about learning how to attack it. Did you happen to have other resources at hand that might have helped you along the way, or was it pretty much open-ended discovery as far as getting your handle on it?
The learning curve on the BMWs are pretty steep. They're just built differently, over-engineered in a lot of aspects. I feel maybe unnecessarily so. For the Honda, to rebuild the entire engine, there's 2 specialty tools. There's a socket you need to take the nut on the clutch assembly off, and there's a puller for the alternator rotor. The BMW, to do anything, you need like a half dozen specialty tools that do one very specific thing that is about impossible to do without. So that's been a big part of the learning curve, is building or buying specialty tools just to work on the thing.
Absolutely. I think most people are terrified mainly of maintenance when it gets into any sort of purchase like that.
Yeah, and they're bottomless pits, kind of, to an extent. Right now, the cylinder heads are in California being reworked by Ted Porter, who's a shop out there, and that's all they do, are airhead, cylinder head rebuilds.
There had to be just a touch of anxiety when you sent those off. Just a little bit.
They were extremely well packaged.
Yeah, absolutely. But so we take the R100, we have the CB750, all your experience with getting those up and running. And when did that take place relative to your time at Blackstone? Did you have both those ready to roll before you first started? Or what?
Trying to think. I was in college when I got the Honda. Prior to that, I had an 81 Yamaha, like a 550. That was the first bike I had bought, first street bike. That was just a $400 Craigslist special. And I knew nothing about bikes when I got that, so I tooled around on that for about 6 months. Rode it to school quite a bit. Didn't really work on it at all. Like, I sold it that following spring, and that gave me the money to buy the Honda at that point.
And the thing that's kind of interesting, the reason why I want to kind of incorporate it in your time at Blackstone is, in the first episode I talked about, we do an engine teardown as part of our training. So when it came time for you to do the engine teardown, I mean, your first time was, in our garage anyway. Was that pretty much old hat for you by then? Like, you saw the thing, you thought, all right, I'm ready to go, or were you still kind of picking up?
That was the first car engine I had been into. I still haven't rebuilt one for my own use. I don't have any collector cars or anything. It's just a little bit different. That thing has a fairly complex timing chain assembly, so getting the engine timed on that was a hurdle the first time.
Yes.
Until you figure out where all the marks go and everything.
Yeah, if I remember right, I think that was easily the most time-consuming aspect.
Usually is, yeah.
of the teardown. But I mean, in every case, when we do that rebuild during training, the goal is always no bonus parts, and I think we've so far been pretty good about that in the training history.
Breaking off torque to yield, head bolts and things.
As far as what you might be working on now, are there any projects in the garage?
We've been restoring a 1970 Triumph. What is that thing? T100 Daytona. It's my father-in-law's bike. He's owned for 20 or 30 years, and we're like 3.5 years into that one. And those are very much their own sort of animal too, with a pretty steep learning curve, similar to the BMWs.
Absolutely, and I mean, you have some pretty widespread experience here. So, in the course of being a report writer, were there commonly asked questions about BMW motorcycles in particular, Honda motorcycles in particular? Were there common issues that people, once they found out you had some insight into these personally, was there any questions you came across on a regular basis?
Not in a few instances, not on a regular basis, because there aren't a ton of these bikes around. But I have seen samples out of at least similar bikes. There was a guy with an old Airhead, BMW Airhead, that had just bought, and the transmission had a bunch of water in it. It looked pretty awful. So I, at least passed along my personal knowledge with those, and gave him a shop that I knew of close to him that had a good reputation for doing work on those bikes.
Well, so you mentioned Airhead. So for the uninitiated, what are we talking about there?
That's what BMW refers to their air-cooled opposed 2-cylinder bikes, which they've made almost continuously, I think, for close to 100 years now. I'd say they've been making the same bike for like 80 years, which isn't quite correct, but it is in some sense.
And there is just a a customer who asked us on our Facebook page, actually. This comes from Greg, by the way. He asked, or stated rather, lots of people seem to be misled on synthetics and clutch slippage. So this is something I've at least heard before, being voiced by customers. Worry about using a synthetic oil and it causing clutch slippage. Do you have any insight on that or experience with that?
I don't think there's anything inherent to the oil being a synthetic product that will cause problems with clutch slippage. And this would be for motorcycles that share oil, engine, clutch, transmission, wet sump or wet clutch engines. There are certain additives that are used in some synthetic car oils that are incompatible with the friction discs in the clutch. So that is something to be mindful of, but it's not a problem with the oil being synthetic that causes the slippage. There's a specification, the JASO MA and MA2, and some oils will have that specification on the bottle, and that signifies that it's compatible with the wet clutch engine. So for my own stuff, that's at least the bikes that are wet clutch. That's really the only criteria that I'm looking for, aside from viscosity when choosing an oil. Being synthetic or conventional is largely unrelated to clutch performance.
And we had a follow-up question to our coolant episode. This one comes from Thomas. And Luke, we'll get your insight on this one. Thomas asked, how much mileage do I need on a sample? And he referenced it in the context of an engine that he's worried about having a problem, whether it be a wear-related problem or a contamination-related problem. He wants to know, how much mileage we want on a sample to get a look at things.
For a typical street-driven vehicle, probably about 1,000 miles in most cases. If you're fairly confident a problem exists, maybe 500 would be kind of a bare minimum. If you sample after fewer miles than that or a very short interval, it's possible the oil just hasn't been in there long enough for much of anything to show up. So it creates a kind of circular problem of, is everything okay, or does it look like this as a result of the short interval? And there's no way to really answer that question. So it leaves some open ambiguity to the result. So
you have to, those low mileage samples, you really have to take them with a grain of salt. Like big problems, they can show up in such a low mileage sample. Again, it's mainly carryover. But if there's a really severe issue, then it probably will show up. But if it's just something like, say the engine isn't wearing terribly well, it's hard to really lend much perspective when you have such a low mileage sample. So shooting for at least 1,000 if you can, it's definitely ideal.
I guess in the case of coolant leaks, if it's something that's been ongoing for a while, a series of oil changes, you could expect some amount of coolant to carry over, or at least the markers from coolant, into the next fill. So that you might see some evidence of it in a low mile sample, but it would still be hard to gauge the severity of the problem.
And that wraps up our first episode on motorcycles. A big thank you to Luke for joining us on the show. Keep in mind, this is only the first episode. We're going to be narrowing it down to more specific topics in the future. And if there are any that you would like to send our way, feel free to drop them on our Facebook page. You can also send them to us directly via email. Address is bstone@blackstone-labs.com. Once again, that is bstone@blackstone-labs.com. Thanks for listening.
Do you want to throw in a cowabunga here?
What's with the cowabunga?